Welcome to the Glassworking Shop. In this video, I'm going to be continuing my experiment in making Damascus style glass. In the last video, I started construction of a triangle piece using 9 layers of flattened color with a black outer layer squeezed together into a triangle. In this video, I'm going to continue by heating the triangle piece, pushing the pattern into it on the squeezer, filling the pattern with some bullseye murrines that I made previously in the first 2 videos, and then squeeze the whole thing together into a triangle and hopefully pull it out successfully for later assembly into a hexagon. So here goes. The first step in the process is going to be to prepare some punties with large moils on them. When I'm pulling down a large solid object, I like to have a big thick punty with a big thick moil. One of the great advantages of the NQALHA is that it easily handles a 20 millimeter or 19 millimeter punty, which is somewhat difficult to work with in handwork. Handworking is kind of easier to use 12 millimeter and 10 millimeter handles because it's easier to spin. But in the NQALHA, larger diameter works just fine. It actually geometrically works a little bit better with the way the rollers are set up, gives a little more control, and provides a whole lot more stability. This punty and moil combination that I've made is one that I've used before, so I already have a kind of a conical thick section on the end, which I always use. I always try to transition from the cylindrical section, from the 20 millimeter section, and then transition into the formed piece. So now I think the guy is hot enough. I'm going to put it in the squeezer and give it a kind of a triangular shape on the end so that it more accurately matches the piece that I'm making. The squeezer camera is a bit of a problem. I'm currently using my still camera for the squeezer, and it does do video, but it doesn't do really good video. It has some really annoying characteristics, like it shuts itself off after a fairly short period of time, causing me to miss some of my squeezes, which is really annoying. So I have another camera on order, and hopefully when it arrives, I have that problem solved. This isn't really that exciting to see, so missing the first squeeze is not much of a problem. I like to get these moils to fairly closely match the shape that I'm going to be making. And this one right now looks like it's a little bit too big. So I'm going to use a little gravity, let it kind of droop down in the Delta Mag flame. I really like the Delta Mag. I really like having a big flame because some of the work that I'm doing is big and getting bigger. As I continue these experiments and continue this adventure, it seems like my pieces get bigger and bigger and bigger. When my triangles are too big, and I'm using fixed size squeezer dies, the fixed size die will not squeeze a triangle that's too big and make it smaller. The only way that I can take a triangle that's too big and reduce its size is to kind of knock off the corners on the tabletop marver by hand, put it in the fire, let gravity do a little, and then I can go back to the squeezer and whip it into shape. Of course, I'm not exactly sure how big my piece is going to be after it's been completely formed, so this moil that I'm making really can't be made perfectly. It'll definitely require some adjustment before I stick it on, but it's nice to get it at least roughly into shape so I don't have to waste a whole lot of time getting it ready when it's time to use it. Okay. I'm going to put this one in the kiln. I'm working with a kind of a little kiln, who knows? Maybe one of these days I'm going to have to upgrade to a bigger one as the work continues getting bigger and bigger. I currently have a little 12 by 12 Paragon, and it really is kind of limiting. When I'm making a pull, I have to make sure that that I don't pull anything long, because a long pull, I'd have to cut it in half to put it in diagonally, and cutting it in half it probably ends up wasting too much of the good pattern that I want. So there's a chance I may be increasing the size of the kiln as I continue making more and more large pieces. This Puntian moil was also made ahead of time and used several times, and I'm reheating it prior to squeezing it roughly into shape. The triangular piece that's reheating in the kiln was the one that I made in the last video. It's the one that is constructed out of the 9 layers of glass inspired by Damascus blacksmithing technique. I've been watching a lot of YouTube blacksmithing, in particular Alex Steele, and I love his energy, I love his enthusiasm, and he's also a darn good blacksmith as well. And not only does he make some really interesting Damascus patterns, but he explains what he's doing, kind of gives a little explanation, makes some diagrams. The blacksmiths that I've seen on other YouTube channels, they show their work, but they don't explain it quite as well. So Hey Alec, if you're watching, thank you. I bet you never thought that blacksmithing techniques would be applied to glasswork. I think there's actually a lot of similarity between glasswork, blacksmithing, and welding. You're working with hot stuff, you can't touch it. The tools are limited. You got a few hand tools, fire, gravity, and of course the NQALHA for glass. You can't forget the NQALHA and the Lytton glass lathe. So there we have another triangle ready to go in the kiln, prepare for next use. And here's my piece, my triangular assembly, and gonna be kind of careful bringing it up to temperature. Certainly don't want it to explode after all this work. And while that's going, I'm gonna fairly carefully check my squeezing dies for radiant heat. And I'm going to replace the triangular dies with some special dies. These are the ones that press a kind of a divot, a kind of a groove into one side. See how they're shaped like that? Even though the points on these guys are fairly sharp, they don't actually make that kind of a pattern on the glass. The glass follows its own geometry, and it tends to have a little bit shallower, not quite as sharp of a point. And the glass rod that I'm planning to, the glass pre-made bullseye murrine that I'm planning to put into the groove is around 10 millimeters or so in diameter. And even though the radius on the end here, it's got like an eighth radius, a quarter diameter on the end, it actually makes a divot in the glass that's close to the correct size for what it is that I'm trying to do. So, probably going to take a while to soak the heat into the core. And what I don't want to do here is overheat the edges, and I'm probably going to take it out of the NQALHA and switch to handwork, because as wonderful as the NQALHA is, constant rotation may end up overheating the corners as the heat soaks into the core, and I slowly build a heat base because, of course, glass is an insulator. What I'm doing on the Marver, I'm not really shaping. I'm just cooling the outer layers so I don't overheat the outer layers. When I'm squeezing, the squeezer does this for me. The glass coming in contact with the graphite squeezing dies does the same thing. It cools the outer layer, leaving the inner heat in the core, but since the piece is pretty much in the correct geometry for the next steps, and I've already changed the squeezer dies in preparation for the upcoming operation, I don't have the squeezer available at the moment for cooling the outer layers. So yeah, okay. Piece is starting to get a little bit loose. I built it on too small of a puntee. This is a highly experimental work that I'm doing here, and I haven't really perfected the process. And one of the slight procedural mistakes that I made was I took my first flat piece of glass for the center of this glass Damascus and put it on a pretty small puntee. This is like a 13 millimeter puntee, and now that the piece has grown, this puntee is just too small. So next time I make one of these, I'm going to form up a more properly sized puntee and moil. And of course, it's always a bit of a challenge here to try to figure out, when I start the assembly of this construction, the initial pieces are pretty small, and then as it gets bigger, I need more support. So the proper strategy may end up being to change puntee and moil as the work progresses. Now also, it's kind of difficult to see what side is what when the glass gets hot. I'm somewhat struggling trying to figure out which side of this is which. So it may not be ready yet, but it may actually be ready. So first squeeze. Okay. Getting a little bit of distortion in the center here. The far end is a little too big. The center is a little too small. But this is very common when doing work on the squeezer. I have to be aware of it. I have to manage it. And I manage it using gravity and pressure, sometimes pressing the piece down into the squeezer as I squeeze. And that corrected much of it. When I first built the squeezer, I kind of had the fantasy that it would be more like a precision instrument, more like a piece of machine shop equipment, and it wouldn't require as much understanding, finessing, babysitting, but you know, it's glasswork. The squeezer does not squeeze perfectly. Of course, the squeezer might squeeze perfectly if my heat was perfect, and as I improve my technique, I'm learning to get my heat better, but at least at the moment, the squeezer definitely requires a lot of understanding, adjustment, correction, and I'm actually standing on the pedal. I'm applying my full weight to squeeze this glass. And of course, the squeezer now with its newly upgraded chain drive can tolerate that very, very well. The original squeezer was built with bicycle cables, and it didn't, you could squeeze a little bit, but it really didn't have the ability to do the higher force squeezing that the chain is capable of. So now my piece is somewhat more uniform. It's a little bulging toward the bottom a little bit. And as I continue to refine it, every time I do a heat, every time I do a squeeze, I'm trying to get it a little more under control. Of course, there is so much going on in this process. By the time I layer in all of the next pieces and then squeeze and layer and squeeze, that it's almost futile to try to get it too perfect at any one step, because it's just going to continue to change. Although, that being said, the argument on the other side is tolerance buildup. Make it as perfect as you can at each step, because any error in the early steps ain't going to go away in future steps and later steps. So it's a kind of a balance between, I don't want to spend all day trying to make it perfect when it's just going to get squeezed some more, and I want to make sure that I have a very good prep ready to go for the next operations. So there we have the, let me see if I can get it over here on the camera. There we have the squeezed piece ready for the next attachment. And the next piece that I'm going to be attaching is over in the kiln. It was made ahead of time. And this is about a 10 millimeter or so bullseye murrine. And I'm keeping my main piece hot. Making these big pieces, one of the most difficult parts of the whole operation is keeping everything hot. So I'm somewhat carefully reheating my bullseye piece in the outer flame, somewhat keeping my target piece hot. And I'm going to be attaching this on the NQALHA using a hand torch. I'm using the Mirage hand torch, which I really, really like. Just in general, I really like using the hand torch with the NQALHA to do this kind of work. So pieces. I didn't pull it completely uniformly. I'm still working on improving my pulling technique to increase the straightness and uniformity of my pulls. So I just used a little bit of gravity there, a little bit of heat and gravity to get this guy a little bit more uniform. So this is going into the channel that I made using the squeezer. Get my diamond shears here. And go back into rotation mode, back into the outer fire, lock off the twist axis, put my part back in the kiln, and don't want to let this guy get cold. And I also want to make sure that it gets tagged well, because right now I'm not super confident in that attachment. So in fact, let me that end, when I was diamond shearing it, got a little off center. So kind of very gently move it back into place. Straighten it out a little bit. Now, I'm going to go back to rotation mode, put the piece out, in the far flame just to kind of keep it warm. Go over to the squeezer. I just had hot glass in it, so I'm very carefully approaching. If the dies are too hot, I'll grab them with the hot gloves, but these actually feel okay to touch with a hand. And then, well, that one, I think that one's going to require a hot glove. Squeezing dies can get pretty darn hot. So I'm switching to my largest fixed die here, which is 1.75 inches. And I'm gonna give this guy just the tiniest squeeze, just to make sure it's tagged in place, because I don't want to squish it totally flat yet, because it's going to get two other pieces right next to it. So I'm pretty happy now. I'm going to go back over to the kiln and get my piece of bullseye. This is the exact same one. This piece goes on two sides, which will form the inner surfaces of the triangle where they fuse together into the hexagon, and it kind of almost produces the most interesting part of the pattern at the point where the triangles meet. So I put the NQALHA in positioning mode and get my torch ready, get my piece ready. And this time, I'm going to have my diamond shear ready in place on my bench. It's already very convenient in my tool rack, but might as well save an extra second or so as I need to cut this thing off. So I'm getting the piece into place. Yeah, this one looks smoother and better than the previous one. And it looks like I made enough material when I was constructing this and pulling it. That end might be useful for something someday. So return to rotation mode, lock off the axis, get it back in the far flame. Don't let it get cold. As the piece gets bigger and bigger, that little bitty punty gets dicier and dicier. So when I get the remaining pieces attached and start squeezing it into its final shape and pulling it, I'm going to switch over to the larger punty and moil. And because I want to concentrate the heat on the piece I just put on and correct a little bit of the distortion that I introduced with the diamond shears. I'm switching to handwork, and then just going to squeeze it the tiniest bit, just barely touch it. Okay, the camera shut off, so I'm repeating that squeeze. Now it's not flattened. I still have some roundness. I still have some inside corners. And into those inside corners, I'm going to be striping some more bullseye murrine that was made previously. Find out where I can touch the punty, because it was in the kiln. So I'm going to be filling in this kind of little bit of an acute angle here. I'm going to be filling this in, striping with a bullseye murrine. And I've had pretty good luck with this method. Produces a kind of an interesting pattern. Part of the bullseye remains, and enough of it remains to be interesting, but it also gives a little bit of a different design in the process of being striped and melted. And I'm squeezing the glass, pushing on the rod just a little bit to try to force it into that acute angle. Normally, when I'm striping, I don't want to upset the substrate. I don't want to create divots in the substrate. But for this particular operation, I kind of do want a very little bit of change in the surface. So and of course I haven't perfected this technique, and it's always a little bit of a surprise wondering how it's going to end up, but it's almost always a pleasant surprise. I've been getting, as I continue to work on this technique, I've been getting better and better results, and it's kind of a combination of practicing my technique, thinking about what I'm going to do, planning in advance, and then reacting to what the glass tells me. Because the glass is teaching me, the glass is showing me what's going on. And there I have the completed assembly that looks fairly reasonable. Back into rotation mode, lock off the twist axis, plenty of fire, off into the far flame, using the full delta mag flame, which I really, really like. Working on pieces at this scale, the delta mag is a great torch. When I was first thinking about it, I was a little bit hesitant, a little bit nervous. I was wondering, wow, do I really need a fire-breathing dragon? And because I had discussed what I was planning on doing with my teachers, they all said, yep, you need a big torch. The biggest piece I ever attempted to make was a triangular assembly, 3 inches on a side, which didn't end well. It didn't end up in the scrap bucket, but it certainly didn't end up as one of my nicer pieces. But boy, it sure did teach me a lot about how big glass gets really hot. In fact, my chrome suit just arrived, and as I prepare this thing for pulling, I think I'm going to go suit up, because the radiant heat from a piece this size can get to be brutal. Okay. Hey, what a fashion statement. Can you believe it? So, just kind of carefully rebuilding the heat base. Looks like the punty is holding up pretty well. The punty and moil are holding up pretty well. Although, if it collapsed, it would collapse right now, right away, so fast it would be almost impossible to recover. I'll go over to the squeezer. Now what I did there, I touched the glass to the squeezer dies with almost no pressure, gave it a moment for the outside of the glass to kind of freeze in place, and then applied fairly serious squeezing pressure using almost my full weight. And of course my full weight today is less than it was before I lost weight, but still, even at my current weight, that's a fairly good amount of squeezing pressure. So I'm just about ready. I'm kind of preparing here by focusing my heat on the far end, on the end away from the punty and moil. I want to get that, and the end is kind of grown a little bit, and so I want to get the bottom flattened, get the end triangularized, kind of firm up the geometry, get the geometry a little bit better, and then attach that big punty that I made. Yes, even with the squeezer does not do all my work for me. I thought it would be a more automatic process than it was. I didn't anticipate how much I was going to have to babysit the thing and constantly adjust and readjust, but you know, it's glass, and that's how glass behaves. So I'm concentrating the squeezing on the far end by not putting the piece all the way down to the bottom of the squeezer. Using gravity a little bit to get the piece to droop a little. I'm adjusting the corners. Also, I'm realizing that even though I try my hardest to do a really good pull with a minimum knuckle and minimum waste of material, it's not going to be good all the way to the end. The part by the punty is pretty much going to be throwaway, so I'm not going to go too horribly crazy trying to perfect the shape on the end. But, like I said before, I like to practice being as precise as I can, even when it doesn't matter. So it's always a kind of a trade-off. It's always a kind of an adjustment of how much do I work on it? How good do I try to make it? How good can I make it? There comes a point when it ain't getting any better, and it's somewhat futile to continue dicking with it. Okay, the far end is looking pretty good. I'm going to put a little more heat on the punty end, knowing that I'm going to have to be careful, because if this thing gets out of control at this point, I'll be in trouble. I'm probably going to give it one more squeeze. And then, this is actually starting to come into shape. Start heating that end over there. And then grab my triangle moil here, which actually is a tiny bit undersized, but I expected that. This is not a surprise. I didn't know exactly what size this thing was going to squeeze to, and when working on the squeezer, it's a lot easier to move the piece up a little bit, get the piece a little bigger than it is to make it smaller. So you don't want to get that fire too close to that punty. And that is looking very much like It's close enough. And there we go. It is stuck in place. Gonna just slightly refine it a little by hand. Although this doesn't have to be perfect, but still, why not make it good? And now I'm going to take off my small punty, which is about a 13 millimeter or so. And I'll probably take off a little bit of glass on the back end, but there's no reason to take off a tremendous lot, since I'm going to be attaching my puller to that end anyway. And I like a really big moil. That end does not need to be stripped down all the way to the color. So I now have a far more secure attachment, assuming that my weld is good, and I believe my weld is good, but I don't have a tremendous lot more work I need to do, and it doesn't need to stay connected for an extremely long time. But it does feel a lot more confident with that big moil and that big punty. Make sure the camera is still recording. Really annoying when the camera shuts off. going to be working mostly on the far end. The punty end is fairly close to its finished geometry, so I'm just going to be working a little bit on the far end, while always remembering to keep the moil hot, keep the punty hot. Don't want my piece falling off. Hey, the chrome suit works. I am a happy camper with my chrome suit. Pulling a large piece like this without a chrome suit, gadzooks, it gets hot. So slowly but surely, I'm kind of massaging this piece into proper triangular form, getting closer all the time. I am just about ready to call it macaroni. Of course, after I pull it and cut it, I'm going to be resizing the triangles anyway, because for two reasons. First off, even though my pulling technique improves every time I do it, I'm not a perfect puller. And second of all, even if I was a perfect puller, the triangle doesn't pull geometrically perfectly. The act of pulling distorts the geometry a tiny bit. And so to get the nicest possible assembly into a hexagon, even if I was really good at pulling, I'd probably want to resize, either hot resize or cold resize on the lap wheel. My patterns typically go all the way to the edge of the piece, and so I'm not really too keen on resizing by grinding. And I believe that, let me just give it a little bit of a reheat here, just a little bit of safety. I believe that is complete. And I can go get my puller out of the kiln and prepare for a fairly large and strenuous pull. Being very, very thankful for my chrome suit. What I'm trying to do is get the end of the puller ripping hot, and then get the end of my piece hot enough to stick, but it doesn't need to be quite as hot as the puller. boy. There goes. I have a weld. Looks reasonable. I'm going to switch to handwork. I think I talked about this before, that it may actually be possible to do pulls on the NQALHA, but at the moment I have more control pulling by hand and better feel. I can feel the glass, and I think that's important. Pulling a triangle is hard. It constantly wants to distort itself. It constantly wants to twist. I really wish I had better pulling technique, but you know, every time I do it, it gets a little better. I think the very competent pullers I've seen get the heat right and then get the pull pretty much. Once the heat is correct, they either get the pull perfect in one pull or apply heat to the source end, and then as they're pulling out of the source, they manage their pulling pressure and timing really accurately and just pull the piece out of one end, out of the source end into the final end. And I don't have that skill yet, so I just do my best. The glass tends to get too hot in the middle. I can already see my middle is starting to thin out, and that tells me that it's time to switch to heating the end. Which is another reason that I have a really nice big moil on the end. Okay. That way I can apply my heat fairly extremely at the end without losing control of my punty. Concentrating on the right-hand side now, since the left-hand side is fairly close to the proper dimension. I've managed to introduce a bit of twist, and hopefully I'll be able to take care of that, but boy, this whole process is right at the edge of my skill level, right at the edge of going out of control. Whew! Is this ever tiring? I tell you, I say, and I'll tell you again. Gadzooks, this is tiring. And hot. And always on the edge of disaster. You know what? I'm going to call that close enough. Except maybe for this other end here, where I seem to have introduced a little bit of twist. Another thing I learned about pulling these very large pieces, that if I concentrate doing it the way I do it, which is incrementally working each end separately, that if I concentrate too much on one end and let the other end get cold, I'm going to have an unpleasant pulling day. So I'm starting to be a little more aware of keeping the overall heat under control. Of course, when I watch the really good glassworkers, when I watch my teachers, they make it look so easy. Like, oh, nothing to it. You just pull the glass out. What could be easier than that? I'm going to call that about as good as it gets. And now I'm going to see how successful I can be cutting it off with the diamond shears. Boy, it sure would suck if it all fell off right now. Of course, I have to cut it off to get it in the kiln. If I had a giant-ass kiln. Success! There is the part. Not perfect, but it'll work. And let me see. Might as well put this guy back in the fire for a little bit. I do reuse these big punties. I mean, why waste them? I reuse them until they get too short, and then I use the leftover glass as raw material to build up a moil on the end of the new punty. So I do like that chrome suit. So for all you glassworkers out there that don't have a chrome suit yet and do big solid work, hey, I strongly recommend them. Thank you for watching. It's been fun.